Thank you, Anita, for sharing that beautiful prayer with us. Let the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. In Bill's majestic reading from the Gospel of Matthew, we find Jesus at a pivotal moment in his life. His earthly ministry is coming to a close. The passage that Bill read begins with 6 days later. Well, I think for context we need to look at what happened 6 days earlier at Caesarea Philippi. There Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do you say I am?" Peter answered for them and said, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." Jesus acknowledged that he was indeed the Messiah. The great Scottish theologian, William Barclay, in his insightful comments, his commentary on the book of Matthew, sees this as a turning point. Jesus realized at this moment that the disciples had turned a corner. They got it. He was not just a great teacher, a great rabbi, a worker of miracles. He was the Messiah that was foretold in the Hebrew Bible. And they understood that. In response, Jesus, from this time forward, began to share openly with them that he had to go to Jerusalem, where he would be killed and where he would rise again from the dead. The disciples must have felt a sense of whiplash. On the one hand, Jesus had said and they had realized that he was the Messiah that was foretold. On the other hand, wasn't the Messiah supposed to be a military hero? A leader who would crush all opposition with fire and sword and set up the greatest kingdom that this world had known since David and Solomon? How could the Messiah submit meekly to death at the hands of his enemies? While the disciples were stewing over these questions, Jesus had a decision to make. He had to decide whether it was time for him to set out on the road to Jerusalem, the road that would lead to the cross in quite a short time, or whether he should continue his earthly ministry for a while. He had to decide whether he had made enough impact to last 2,000 years and more. And as Jesus always did in times of crisis, in times when a big decision, a life-changing decision had to be made, he prayed. And as he did so often when he prayed, he went up on a mountain. He took with him his inner circle, Peter and the brothers James and John. Perhaps Jesus wanted them to experience his divine glory, to help them to grapple with his concept of messiahship, and to help them to face the terrible days that lay ahead. Bill's magisterial reading from the book of Matthew depicts one of the most glorious and uplifting passages in the New Testament. And yet the story of the Transfiguration is one that many of us find confusing, inaccessible, and deeply strange. I know I have often just blipped over it in my hurry to get to Jerusalem and to the Passion of Christ. Let's try to unpack it a little bit. The books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Synoptic Gospels, all have a full and very similar account of what happened on the Mountain of Transfiguration. They all describe this event with awe and with a sense of glory that shines through and still sends shivers down my spine 2,000 years later. As he prays up on the mountain, Jesus becomes transformed. The disciples see that his face begins to shine like the sun. His clothes become, in Mark's words, dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. In the words of the King James Version, and I have to confess that although I do read the Revised Standard and other modern translations for clarity, I often return to the King James Version for the majesty of the words. Surely the most beautiful words ever produced by a committee. In the King James Version of Mark's description, and his raiment became shining, exceeding white as snow, so as no fuller on earth can white them. And here's one of the problems with the King James Version. What does fuller mean? Well, I had to look it up. It was a person who treated cloth back in the early 1600s. So even in the age of miracles that the disciples lived in, even having seen all that Jesus could do, this was something special. This stood out for them. The Gospel of Luke adds an interesting detail. The three disciples are, quote, weighed down with sleep. This may be an indication that the events took place at night. Can you imagine Jesus shining like a beacon in the deep darkness of the mountain? Truly an awesome sight. Truly an awful sight in the old meaning of the word, inspiring awe. Not only is Jesus transfigured in front of the awestruck disciples, but then two of the most important figures in Jewish history, Moses, the great lawgiver, and Elijah, the great prophet, appear suddenly. And as the disciples look, they are talking with Jesus. They appear, quote, in their glory, unquote, which I assume means they were shining too. To cap it all off, a luminous cloud descends and envelops them or overshadows them. And the voice of God speaks from the cloud. This is my beloved Son. Listen to him. Small wonder that the disciples were terrified. In the words of the King James Version, sore afraid, and fell on their faces. If Jesus intended to provide an inspiring spectacle to the three disciples, he could not have managed it better. Barclay and others argue that in commanding the disciples to listen to Jesus, God is giving Jesus preeminence over Moses and Elijah, and as they represent all of the laws and the prophets of the Old Testament. Matthew's account in the King James Version is peppered with the exclamation, behold, as if he could not contain his excitement and awe at what was going on. And behold, there appeared unto them Moses and Elijah. Behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them. And behold, a voice came out of the cloud. To me, this dramatizes the event. It makes what happened to Peter, James, and John leap off the page. I'm sorry that the Revised Standard Version didn't see fit to include that behold. The book of Luke adds another interesting detail. It tells us what Elijah and Moses were talking to Jesus about. It's as if one of the disciples heard just a snatch of their conversation, and he recorded it. They are speaking to him to Jesus, of his, quote, departure, which he would accomplish at Jerusalem, unquote. Now, the word departure is a translation from the Greek word exodus, a word indelibly associated with the time when the entire Jewish people put their fate in the hands of God, set off on a dangerous journey to the Promised Land. Jesus was about to do something very similar. He was about to set off on a similar journey, putting his fate in the hands of God. So the Transfiguration sets the stage for the entry into Jerusalem, the suffering, the death on the cross, and the glorious resurrection. The key disciples have seen Jesus affirmed by two of the most revered figures from the Hebrew Bible and reaffirmed by the voice of God. They have glimpsed Jesus in his heavenly glory and been given a deeper understanding of his deity. The glory of the Transfiguration would help the disciples to grapple with the concept of Messiah, a Messiah who is destined to die at the hands of his enemies, ignominiously at the hands of his enemies. It would give them hope in the terrible time ahead. Their witness of the Transfiguration has been passed down through the Gospels to all future generations and is still strengthening the faithful, as even today we face Lent and Maundy Thursday and Good Friday. I'm struck by the last three words that God speaks. The last three words that God speaks out loud in the New Testament, except as Sally reminded me in the book of Revelation, which I will set aside a bit. But God's last three words were, listen to him. Are we still listening? Are we straining to hear the voice of Jesus and God that may come to us as it did to Elijah out of the stillness? Speaking for myself, I think I need to find more time in my life, which is sometimes chaotic, even though I'm retired. Those of you who are retired will know it can be even more chaotic than it was before. I need to find more time to find my own mountaintop. Or, given that the highest promontory on the Cape is barely 300 feet high, the length of a football field, half as high as the Washington Monument, perhaps a windy, wintry Cape Cod beach would be the place to find stillness. Listening for God is hard, but so is seeing and appreciating the glory that God has spread all around us. Most of us don't have enough beholds in our life. We see so many miraculous sights on television, on our computers, on our smartphones, that the behold reflex has just atrophied over the years, I think. We're conditioned to find logical explanations of everything around us. And I fear most of us, myself included, for sure, have absorbed at least some of the cynicism that pervades our culture. I don't know if any of you watch the old black and white movies on the Turner Classic Movie Channel, but I find myself drawn to them more and more as the fare that Hollywood dishes out becomes more and more violent and cynical. And I'm struck by the naivety of the people in these old black and white movies, the naivety and simplicity of the plots. I don't think it's their naivety. I think it's our cynicism that, looking back on it, makes it look like naive. Nevertheless, there are behold minutes in our lives, are there not? The Super Bowl. The final 20 minutes of the Super Bowl. How can anyone be cynical about a team coming back from a 28-3 deficit for the first time in history to win the Super Bowl? But that only happens once a year. Maybe watching the birth of a child, a spectacular sunset, winning the lottery. I know someone who won $1 million in the lottery. That was a behold minute for sure. Maybe getting solar panels for the church. I have a vision of a great behold coming out as you all leave the church and go out there and see that white picket fence with all the new solar panels behind it. As we get older, however, I suspect there's a tendency to lose our capacity to feel wonder And we forget to thank God for the miracles that unfold in front of our eyes every day. I remember watching our 3-year-old granddaughter, Nina. One morning she came down into the kitchen very early, and it was the first snowfall of the year. She couldn't remember ever having seen snow before. She was so excited that she was jumping up and down. Her whole body was quivering, and she was shouting, "It knowing, it knowing!" She had trouble with her S's. If only I could recapture that sense of marvel and wonder. I've resolved to open my heart to more behold moments. Will you? Amen.
Amen.